Hello, Dr. Elmer, Advanced Neurospinal Solutions, and we're talking about stroke. What is stroke? Uh, when it boils down to it, it's going to be a change, an alteration in blood flow to the brain, and it's very interesting in looking at stroke how it acts so much like so many other conditions. Why? Because the nervous system, when you affect a system, it's consistent in what it accomplishes. If you've got problems with nausea, you've got a problem with cranial nerve 10 and the bottom of the brainstem. Well, that's where the symptoms are coming from. That's the what. But the why, it could be 150,000 different reasons why it's happening. So knowing that it's cranial nerve 10, knowing the pathway and how those things work is incredibly helpful, but then knowing how to figure out what's causing that. By the way, a fun little fact, if you've got a problem with nausea, you can knock it down usually with antihistamine, Claritin, right? Ooh, did I say that out loud? I should use my inside my head voice. Something like that, because the pathway, one of the neurotransmitters is histamine. And so we're knocking down that histamine, and the pathway, it's like it breaks the pathway, and it can't fire correctly. And that. So, but be that as it may, a stroke, if I'm like this, what is it? You say, if I'm born with it, we call it cerebral palsy. If it's because I had an autoimmune disorder, it's attacking my brain, we call it MS. If it's because of I had a brain injury, it's a traumatic brain injury, to that area. If it happened because of loss of blood or a brain bleed just out of nowhere, we call it a stroke. And so that's what a stroke is. Now the problem with a stroke is it damages tissue. Now you can have strokes without having strokes. Whoa, that sounds weird. Yeah, you can have a stroke without having a stroke, and the effect is that you wind up having stroke-like symptoms, and then it could potentially go away. We call that a TIA, transient ischemic attack. Let's break that down. Transient, it comes and goes. Ischemic, meaning the lack of oxygen, and then it attacks you, right? And so that transient ischemic attack is basically a precursor, a shot over the bow, a warning, hey, we're looking at an environment that could potentially lead to a stroke, and when you get the stroke, you're going to have dead tissue. If you're going to bleed, or if you're going to clot, and it decreases the oxygen to that area, or, like I say, the bleeder, I call it bleeder versus clotter, the bleeder is going to start to damage the tissue that's around it because of the leak, and that tissue won't come back. There's some of it that is around that is dysfunctional, and you have to bring it back into labor, into function. You have to do that gently. You have to know what you're doing, or you could kill it too. But in stroke, there are two arteries that are the main arteries that come up into your head. You've got the internal carotid, and you've got the vertebral arteries that become the basivertebral system that sits on the brainstem. It sits on the brainstem and supplies the brainstem, and then it comes up into the back, where the cerebellum is. My brain's falling apart. Comes up into the back where the cerebellum is, and it gives the blood flow to the bottom of the brain, which is where the hippocampus is, in the temporal lobe and the hippocampus. That's where your long-term storage, we call it declarative memory, is. And the back of the brain, which is the occipital lobe, which is where your vision is. And so the kinds of things that you would normally see from that posterior system are pretty drastic. Many people who have brainstem strokes don't make it. They die. Why? Because everything that's important that keeps you alive is in the brainstem. It's the stuff you don't think about that keeps you functioning. Okay, so that kind of stroke is often just disastrous, and they're very difficult to rehab from. But there's still function that can usually be gotten with the right kind of therapy and the right kind of rehab. The internal carotid that comes up more in the front, it loops around to your eye, and then it comes up and divides up into a strip, taking care of a strip here of the brain called the anterior cortical artery, and then there's the middle, or the middle cerebral, the anterior cerebral, and the middle cerebral, and the middle cerebral divides up into two parts. Wow, there goes my cerebellum. And it supplies the frontal parietal areas, and it also supplies the outside of the temporal lobe. And that's 85% of your brain. And that's what we talked about in the red dot test, is that red desaturation. When one eye has lost blood flow compared to the other, you start to lose the color red. And that's why the two dots, one of the dots is going to be a lighter shade or even smaller than the other, and that tells us where the blood flow is diminished on that side. And then we do some stuff with the cortex, turn it up, we have them smell peppermint, move their eyes to the opposite direction, and then pretty soon the blood flow comes up and we can retest, and wow, look, they're the same now, which is really cool. So, but a stroke, like I said, has an impact on the brain and the areas that it got hurt. A motor type effect is going to cause, like I say, that spasming. If it's in the sensory area, it's going to cause sensory effects. I could wind up with paresthesias in the arm. It would still be dysfunctional, but it wouldn't be the same kind of dysfunctional as if it's in Brodmann's area 4 or 6, where it's actually doing the motor part of the system. And so knowing about the different parts of the brain, knowing about the functions of the different parts, are literally going to tell you where it is and how you're going to do the rehab. I always say in here, the closer you get to the truth, the simpler the solution. So if you have any other questions about stroke, the traditional methods of taking care of it, and that it's usually stretching if it's a motor type of a stroke, and that they're going to try to get you up and do those things that you can't do, and that many of those things have a minimal effect because the brain has been damaged. If you have any other questions, please let us know. I'd be happy to do many more videos on this. Happy to do many more videos on this to bring clarity on what the problem is and how we solve it. So remember, we're here when you're ready to take your life back.